In The Godfather or The Sopranos, they often speak Italian or use Italian expressions, but it's not like normal Italian. Why is that? I know what you're thinking. They're mobsters. Of course they speak kind of like street, but it's more complicated than that. For instance, the Italian spoken in the Godfather movies technically isn't Italian. It's a separate language. This is because unlike the United States, where different regions of the United States have different accents, different regions of Italy have different languages. So for instance, Sicily, where the Godfather's characters are from, has a group of dialects that are collectively called the Sicilian language, and they're not mutually intelligible with the Italian language. The Italian language that's usually referred to as Italian is just one of the many Italian languages that was chosen as a standard. However, it gets a little confusing because in Italian they refer to these languages as dialetti, which means dialects. And it's also confusing because many Italians are fluent in one of these dialetti and also standard Italian. But at least from my perspective as somebody who can understand Italian pretty well, I was not able to understand almost any Sicilian until I studied a little bit more. And I've heard that native speakers of standard Italian have trouble understanding too. In The Sopranos, I believe a lot of their expressions come from another southern Italian language called Napoletano. But since many Italian Americans have roots from different parts of Italy, it's possible that it was influenced by other languages as well. The reason these characters don't speak standard Italian is because standard Italian is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. The Tuscan dialect that's now the standard has had prestige for hundreds of years, but it wasn't really widely spoken outside of Tuscany until the last century. So many Italian immigrants to the United States actually didn't speak Italian. However, people in the regions where they're from today probably do speak Italian. The Roman Empire wiped out a lot of languages all over Europe, but they started by doing this in Italy. Today, basically all Italian languages come from Latin, but Latin is just one of many languages that was spoken in Italy before the Roman Empire. And just like Italian and Spanish are sibling languages because they both come from Latin, Latin had siblings too. For instance, languages like Oscan, Umbrian, and Faliscan had the same relationship to Latin that Spanish does to Italian. They all come from an unwritten language that can be reconstructed called Proto-Italic. So Oscans and Umbrians and Faliscans were some of the first peoples to be Romanized. This is because their related languages and cultures made it easier for them to learn Latin. But there were other languages that weren't really siblings to Latin. We'll start with the cousins. In parts of southern Italy, dialects of ancient Greek were spoken, and Greek is distantly related to Latin. The same goes with the Celtic languages in northern Italy. In fact, Celtic languages are thought to be even more related to Latin than Greek is, or at least they have a more recent ancestor language. But there were also languages that weren't related to Latin at all. For instance, the Etruscans that lived in modern-day Tuscany spoke a non-Indo-European language. So all those other languages I was saying were related to Latin were Indo-European. But Etruscan probably descends from a language that was spoken in Italy before the Indo-Europeans even came. And there were probably other languages related to Etruscan spoken in different parts of Italy. Partially because Etruscan was so different from Latin, they weren't Romanized as fast as other peoples in Italy. In fact, a lot of Romans admired Etruscan civilization. But after centuries of Roman control, Romanization was a pretty thorough process in Italy. So the linguistic diversity of Italy kind of went through this bottleneck where everybody learned Latin and then started turning it into different languages again. And this process of homogenization and then diversification is pretty common in historical linguistics. Did you know that some Italians speak Greek and they're not like Greek immigrants or anything? Some Italian communities have been speaking Greek for hundreds of years or maybe even thousands. It's often called Italiot Greek. Long before Latin was spoken everywhere in Italy, a lot of southern Italians spoke Greek. Obviously, I don't mean that they were Italians in the national sense because nobody was back then, but they lived on the Italian peninsula and they're the ancestors of many modern Italians. And they continued to speak Greek throughout the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire. And under Byzantine rule, Greek continued to thrive after that. And the most popular theory on the origins of Italiot Greek is that it actually has pre-Roman origins in Italy. Other theories disagree because Italiot Greek is actually still pretty similar to modern Greek. And you'd expect there to be a lot more differences after thousands of years. Like think about how different the Romance languages are. But one explanation for that is just that Italiot Greek and Greek Greek co-evolved. Both varieties were united by the Eastern Roman Empire a lot more recently than the Western Roman Empire united the Romance languages. So it makes sense that this more recent shared influence would make the languages more similar today, even if they would have been a lot more different without it. But that's not to say Italiot Greek is not unique. One thing, it preserves the Greek infinitive, which is lost in most varieties of Greek today. And it also has a lot of Italian vocabulary too. Sadly, it's losing a lot of speakers, but there are revitalization efforts. Hope you enjoyed the video. Now go start a debate in the comments about the terminology for the Eastern Roman Empire. Arabic used to be spoken in what is now Italy 1,000 years ago, and this Italian Arabic actually still survives today. In the 800s, Arab conquerors took over the islands of Sicily and Malta in the Mediterranean Sea, and Sicily is now part of Italy. At that time, the inhabitants of Sicily spoke Greek and an early version of the Sicilian Romance language, and that came from Latin. But under their new rulers, some Sicilians started speaking Arabic. But because of their close contact with other languages and their isolation from the rest of the Arabic-speaking world, the Arabic spoken in Sicily became very unique. It developed into a new language called Siculo-Arabic, and it borrowed a ton of words from the local Sicilian Romance language. And many of these Siculo-Arabic speakers moved to Malta, which had been largely depopulated after the initial Arab conquest. Later in the 1000s, the Normans conquered Sicily and expelled a lot of the Siculo-Arabic speakers. And gradually, the language died out in Sicily. However, the language persisted on the island of Malta and developed into the modern language Maltese. And Maltese is really interesting because it's kind of similar to English in some ways. So English is a Germanic language with a huge influence from the Romance language Norman French. It's where we get a ton of our technical vocabulary. And similarly, Maltese is a Semitic language with a huge influence from a different Romance language, Sicilian. And more recently, it's had a lot of influence from Standard Italian and English. As a Semitic language, its roots are fundamentally different from Italian or English, but it shares a lot of vocabulary. So while you definitely couldn't read Maltese as an English speaker, you could probably get a general idea of what the topic is just based on cognates.